What if the quiet neighbor you trusted most harbored a secret so dark it would shatter your perception of betrayal? I thought I knew the man next door, but a shocking discovery about his past, involving his own son, forced me to unravel a web of deceit I never saw coming. Prepare for a story that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about those closest to you. My name is Daniel Morrison, and for 5 years I lived next door to a man I thought I understood. His name was Thomas Whitmore, and on the surface, he was exactly what you'd expect from a 72-year-old retired accountant living alone in a quiet suburban neighborhood. He kept his lawn immaculate, waved politely when we passed on the streets, and never caused trouble. He was forgettable in that comfortable way elderly neighbors often are part of the scenery. Reliable, invisible. But I was wrong about Thomas Whitmore. Catastrophically, devastatingly wrong. And when I finally uncovered the truth about his past, about what his son had done to him, about the betrayal that had shattered his entire life, I realized that the quiet, unremarkable man next door was actually the most tragic figure I'd ever known. Before we go further, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because this story is about the secrets we keep, the betrayals that destroy us, seeing the way trauma can turn a person into a ghost of who they once were. Let's begin. The intriguing neighbor. Next door, I moved into my house in March 2018. It was a modest 3-bedroom in a neighborhood that real estate agents called established, which is code for the houses are old and that residents are older. My wife Sarah and I were in our mid-30s, the youngest people on the block by at least 20 years. We bought the house because it was affordable and because we liked the quiet. Thomas Whitmore lived in the house to our right. He was there the day we moved in, watching from his porch as the moving truck unloaded our belongings. He didn't offer to help, not out of rudeness, I don't think, but out of that particular reserve elderly people sometimes have around younger folks. When I walked over to introduce myself, he shook my hand with a grip that was surprisingly firm. "Thomas Whitmore," he said. "Welcome to the neighborhood. Daniel Morrison. This is my wife, Sarah." Sarah waved from where she was directing the movers. Thomas nodded in her direction, then looked back at me. "If you need anything, I'm usually home. Quiet house. I keep to myself mostly. Sounds good." Same here. That was the extent of our first conversation. Looking back, I should have noticed things even then. The way Thomas's eyes didn't quite focus when he looked at you, like he was seeing through you to something else. The way his house, despite being immaculately maintained on the outside, had all the curtains drawn, all the windows dark. The way he spoke in clipped, precise sentences that gave away nothing. But I didn't notice. I was too busy with my own life, settling into the new house, adjusting to a new commute to my job as a software engineer, helping Sarah set up her home office for her graphic design business. Thomas was just the neighbor, unremarkable, forgettable over the first year. I learned the rhythm of Thomas's life through passive observation. He woke early. I'd see his kitchen light on at 5:30 a.m. when I got up for my morning run. He left his house around 9 a.m. every day, driving his 20-year-old Honda Civic to unknown destinations. He'd return by noon, carrying groceries or prescriptions or nothing at all. He never had visitors. His phone never rang that I could hear. His mailbox received bills and junk mail and nothing personal. He mowed his lawn every Saturday at precisely 8 a.m. He took his trash out Thursday nights for Friday pickup. He kept his hedges trimmed, his gutters clean, his driveway swept. His life was a series of routines executed with mechanical precision. Each day identical to the last dot. Sarah noticed it before I did. "Don't you think it's strange?" she asked one evening as we sat on our back deck watching the sunset. "What's strange?" "Thomas, he's been living here for how long?" "I think Mrs. Henderson said he moved in about 15 years ago. 15 years in this neighborhood, and he has no friends, no visitors, no family who checks on him. Maybe he likes his privacy. It's privacy, and then there's isolation. That man is isolated." I looked at Thomas's house. All the lights were off except for one, the kitchen, where I could see Thomas's silhouette moving around, probably making dinner for one. Maybe he lost his wife. Maybe he's still grieving for 15 years. People grieve differently. Sarah shook her head. There's something else. Something wrong. I can feel it. I dismissed her intuition then. Sarah was prone to reading too much into people's behavior, creating narratives where none existed. But as the months went on, I started noticing things that supported her theory, like the fact that Thomas never smiled. Not when I waved at him. Not when Mrs. Henderson complimented his roses. Not even when the neighbor kid's dog escaped and ran through his yard barking joyfully. His face remained impassive, neutral, showing no emotion beyond mild acknowledgement of the world around him, or the way he flinched at sudden sounds. A car backfiring. A door slamming. The landscaping crew's leaf blower starting up. Each time Thomas would freeze, his entire body going rigid for just a moment before he forced himself to continue whatever he'd been doing. Or the way he avoided eye contact during the rare conversations we had. He'd look at my chin, my shoulder, the space just past my head, anywhere but directly at me. And his responses were always brief, designed to end the interaction as quickly as possible. How are you, Thomas? Fine. Nice weather we're having. Yes. Need any help with those groceries? No, thank you. Conversation over. Door closed. Curtains drawn. 2 years into living next to Thomas, I started actively wondering about him. Not in a creepy surveillance, why I wasn't spying on him or anything invasive. But I found myself paying attention, collecting data points, trying to understand the puzzle of this man who'd removed himself so completely from human connection. I mentioned my curiosity to my friend Marcus during a barbecue at our house. Marcus was a private investigator, not the glamorous kind from movies, but the kind who does background checks for companies and tracks down deadbeat dads for family court. He found my interest amusing. Want me to run a background check on your neighbor? Could you? Could I? Sure. Should I? Probably not without a reason. What if the reason is that I'm concerned about him? Concerned how? You think he's dangerous? No, I think he's broken. And I want to know why. Marcus considered this. You know that knowing someone's tragedy doesn't obligate you to fix it, right? Oh, I know. But maybe understanding would help me be a better neighbor. Or maybe it'll just burden you with information you can't do anything about. He was probably right. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and once planted, it grows roots. I found myself thinking about Thomas at odd moments, wondering what had happened to make him so utterly alone, so thoroughly disconnected from the world. The turning point came in October 2020, during the pandemic. Our neighborhood, already quiet, became even more isolated. People stayed inside. The streets were empty. The usual rhythms of suburban life, kids walking to school, people driving to work, weekend gatherings disappeared. Thomas's routine didn't change. He still woke at 5:30, still drove away at 9, still returned by noon. But one day, I noticed something different. He was standing in his driveway, staring at his car like he'd forgotten what it was for. He stood there for 15 minutes, perfectly still, just staring. I walked over. Thomas, you okay? He turned to look at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before: confusion. Deep, disorienting confusion. I was going somewhere, he said slowly. I can't remember where. Maybe you don't need to go anywhere today. It's okay to just stay home. No, I had a destination. It was important. What was it? He stared at me, his face working through some internal struggle. Then, quietly, I don't remember. I helped him back inside his house. It was the first time I'd ever been past his front door, and what I saw shocked me. The house was immaculate, spotlessly clean. Perfectly organized, but it was also empty. Not of furniture, but of personality. No photographs on the walls. No personal items on shelves. No signs that a human being with a history, with connections, with memories actually lived there. Thomas, do you have family I can call? Someone who checks on you. No family, friends. No, a doctor. Someone who knows you? He looked at me with those hollow eyes. There's no one, Daniel. There hasn't been anyone for a very long time. That's when I decided to find out why. Unveiling the first secret sigh. Started my investigation the way any millennial would with Google. I searched Thomas Whitmore plus various combinations of his age, our city, his profession. I found nothing. No social media profiles, not surprising for someone his age. No news articles. No public records beyond the basics of property ownership and voting registration. So I expanded my search. I looked for Thomas Whitmore in other cities, thinking maybe he'd moved here from somewhere else. Still, nothing that matched his age and profile. Then I tried a different approach. I went to the county courthouse and looked up property records for his house. Thomas had bought it in 2005 for $220,000, paying cash. Before that, the house had belonged to an elderly woman who died. But the interesting thing was the address listed for Thomas at the time of purchase it was in a different state, about 3 hours away. I searched for Thomas Whitmore in that state. Suddenly, results appeared. Lots of them. The first article I found was from a local newspaper dated June 2004. Local businessman dies by suicide. Family questions death. The article was brief, almost clinical in its details. Thomas Whitmore Jr., age 42, successful investment manager, had been found dead in his home office from an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound. He left behind a wife, Jennifer, and 2 children, a son, Marcus, age 18, and a daughter, Kelly, age 14. The article mentioned that family members were questioning the suicide ruling, suggesting that Thomas Jr. had no history of depression and had seemed in good spirits in the days before his death. My neighbor's name was Thomas Whitmore. This dead man was Thomas Whitmore Jr. That meant, ... I searched for more articles. Found an obituary that confirmed it. Thomas Whitmore Jr. is survived by his wife Jennifer, children Marcus and Kelly, and father Thomas Whitmore Sr., age 62. Thomas Whitmore Sr., my neighbor. This was his son who died. I kept digging. Found another article from a few months after the death. Investment manager's death ruled suicide. $4 million missing from client accounts. The details were damning. An audit of Thomas Jr.'s investment firm had revealed massive fraud. He'd been running a Ponzi scheme, stealing from clients to pay returns to other clients, enriching himself in the process. When the scheme collapsed, he'd stolen approximately $4 million. Rather than face prosecution, he'd killed himself. The article mentioned that clients were suing the estate, that Thomas Jr.'s wife and children would likely lose everything, that Thomas Jr.'s father, a retired accountant, had co-signed loans for his son's business and would also face financial ruin. Another article from 2005. Fraud victims win judgment against Whitmore estate. Family homes seized, the lawsuits had succeeded. Thomas Jr.'s widow and children had lost their house, their savings, everything. The article mentioned that Thomas Sr. had also lost his home to satisfy judgments against him for the loans he'd co-signed. Multiple families had been financially destroyed by Thomas Jr.'s fraud. I sat in the courthouse archive room, staring at these decade-old articles, and felt sick. My quiet neighbor, the man who kept to himself, who had no visitors, who lived in that empty house with no photographs, had lost everything. His son had been a criminal who'd killed himself. His grandchildren had been destroyed financially. His entire world had collapsed. But there was more. I kept searching and found something that made the tragedy infinitely worse. An article from late 2005. Widow of fraudulent investment manager commits suicide. Jennifer Whitmore, age 40, Thomas Jr.'s widow, had taken her own life 8 months after her husband's death. The article said she'd been struggling with depression following the loss of her husband, her home, and her reputation. She'd been found by her teenage children, who were now orphans being raised by relatives. 2 suicides. A massive fraud. A family destroyed. And Thomas Sr., my neighbor, at the center of it all. Losing his son, his daughter-in-law, his home, his reputation, and his grandchildren in one catastrophic implosion. I understood now why his house had no photographs, why he had no visitors, why he'd removed himself from human connection so completely. He was living with guilt and grief so enormous it had consumed every other part of his life. But I still didn't know the full story. I didn't know the role Thomas's other grandson, Marcus, the son, had played in all of this. The son's shocking lie should have stopped there. I'd found the source of Thomas's trauma. I understood why he was the way he was. That should have been enough, but it wasn't. Because there was something else in those articles, something mentioned in passing that caught my attention. A quote from one of the fraud victims. Thomas Jr. told us his father had reviewed the investments and confirmed they were legitimate. We trusted Thomas Sr.'s judgment. He was a respected accountant. We believed him when he vouched for his son. Thomas Sr. had vouched for his son's firm. He'd told clients it was legitimate. He'd used his reputation to bring in investors who'd then lost everything. Had he known about the fraud? Had he been complicit? Or had his son betrayed him, using his father's reputation to legitimize a criminal enterprise? I needed to know. I went back to the archives, this time looking for court documents from the lawsuits. Found depositions. Found testimony. Found the truth. Thomas Sr. had not known about the fraud. According to his deposition, he'd reviewed his son's business materials and believed them to be legitimate. He'd vouched for his son because he trusted him, because he'd raised him to be honest, because he never imagined his own child would lie to him. The betrayal was complete. Thomas Jr. had used his father's trust and reputation to steal from innocent people. When the scheme collapsed, Thomas Sr. hadn't just lost his son to suicide, he'd lost everything because his son had deliberately made him complicit. But it got worse. So much worse, I found a local blog that had covered the story more extensively than the newspapers. The blogger had interviewed people close to the family, including a former neighbor who'd known Thomas Jr. since childhood. According to this neighbor, Marcus Thomas Jr.'s 18-year-old son had known about the fraud. Not at first, but in the months before everything collapsed. Thomas Jr. had confessed to his son that the business was failing, that he'd made bad investments, that he was using new client money to pay old clients. He'd told Marcus he was trying to fix it, that it would all work out. Marcus had believed his father, or at least he'd wanted to believe him. So when Thomas Sr. started asking questions about the business, when he started suggesting maybe he should do a more thorough audit, Marcus had lied to his grandfather. Dad says everything's fine, Grandpa. I've seen the books. It's all legitimate. Marcus had used his grandfather's trust in him to protect his father's fraud. And when everything collapsed, when Thomas Jr. killed himself and the truth came out, Marcus had blamed his grandfather. According to the blog, Marcus had confronted Thomas Sr. at the funeral. In front of everyone, he'd screamed at his grandfather, "This is your fault. You should have stopped him. You should have known. You're supposed to be the accountant. You're supposed to be the one who checks these things. Dad is dead because you failed him." Marcus had needed someone to blame for his father's suicide, and he'd chosen his grandfather, the man who'd co-signed loans to help his son, who'd vouched for his son's business out of trust, who'd lost everything just like everyone else. After his mother's suicide, Marcus had been taken in by relatives on Jennifer's side of the family. Those relatives, also angry and grieving, had blamed Thomas Sr. for both deaths. They'd gotten a restraining order preventing Thomas from contacting his grandchildren. They'd spread rumors that Thomas had known about the fraud, that he'd been complicit, that he'd sacrificed his son to save himself. None of it was true. But truth doesn't matter when people need someone to blame. Thomas Sr. lost his son, his daughter-in-law, his grandchildren, his home, his reputation, and his reason for living, all because his son had betrayed him and his grandson had blamed him for things he couldn't have prevented. I found one final document that shattered me completely. A letter attached to a court filing, written by Thomas Sr. to the judge overseeing the fraud cases. "I understand that I am legally responsible for the loans. Co-signed. I will pay what I owe to the extent of my ability, which will mean losing my home and my savings. I accept this consequence. But I want the court to understand that I did not know about my son's crimes. I trusted him. I loved him. I believed in him. That was my mistake, and I will pay for it for the rest of my life. But please, I beg you, do not let my grandchildren believe that I was complicit. They have lost so much already. Please do not let them lose the memory of a grandfather who loved them. That is all I have left to give them the truth of my innocence and the truth of my love. Please." The judge had ruled against him anyway. Thomas lost everything, and Marcus, his grandson, had never forgiven him. According to the blog, Marcus had testified in the civil cases, saying his grandfather should have known and had a responsibility to prevent this. He'd told reporters that his grandfather was as guilty as my father. Marcus was now 36 years old, same age as me, living somewhere in the state, according to the last information I could find. He'd changed his last name, no longer Whitmore. He wanted nothing to do with that legacy of fraud and suicide, and Thomas Sr., my quiet neighbor, had spent 15 years living in this small house with no photographs, no connections, no joy, no purpose beyond mechanical routine. He'd spent 15 years being blamed for crimes he didn't commit by the grandson he'd loved and lost. The aftermath and repercussions. I sat with this knowledge for days, not knowing what to do with it. Part of me wanted to tell Thomas I knew, to let him talk about it, to offer some kind of understanding or comfort. But another part of me, the part that respected privacy, that understood some wounds are too deep to probe, told me to stay silent. Sarah noticed the change in me. "You found something," she said. Not a question. "Yeah, about Thomas." "Yeah. Are you going to tell me?" I told her everything. She cried when I got to the part about Marcus blaming his grandfather. "That's so unfair. He was a victim too." "But he looks like a perpetrator. He vouched for his son's business. He co-signed the loans. On paper, he enabled the fraud even though he didn't know it was happening. Do you think he blames himself? I think he spent 15 years blaming himself." The next week, I saw Thomas struggling to carry groceries from his car. I went over to help. He tried to refuse, but I took the bags anyway and carried them to his kitchen. Inside his house, I looked around with new eyes. No photographs, because every photograph would show his son, his daughter-in-law, his grandchildren, everyone he'd lost. Every photograph would be a reminder of betrayal and blame. "Thomas," I said carefully, "I know you like your privacy, but if you ever want to talk about anything at all of me, good listener." He looked at me with those hollow eyes. It wasn't a question. Somehow he'd sensed it. Yes. How much? Enough. He sat down heavily at his kitchen table. "Then you know I'm responsible for destroying multiple families, for creating a criminal, for failing to protect innocent people from my own son." "That's not true. You were a victim. I co-signed those loans. I vouched for his business. I brought him clients. I am responsible. You were lied to. You trusted your son, and trust is not due diligence. I'm an accountant. I know how to check books, how to identify fraud. I chose not to look too closely because he was my son and I wanted to believe in him. That choice cost people their life savings. You didn't know. I should have known." Marcus was right about that. A father should know when his son is lying. An accountant should recognize fraud. I failed on both counts. We sat in silence for a long moment. Then Thomas spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "The worst part isn't the money. It's not even the legal consequences. It's that my grandson Marcus, he hates me. He blames me for his father's death, his mother's death, everything. And I can't argue with him because maybe he's right. Maybe if I'd been more diligent, if I'd asked harder questions, if I'd done my job as an accountant instead of trusting as a father, none of this would have happened." "Has Marcus tried to contact you?" "No, the restraining order expired years ago, but he's never reached out. I don't blame him." What would I say? "Sorry, your father was a criminal and I wasn't smart enough to see it." That doesn't fix anything. It might help him understand he doesn't want to understand. He wants me to be the villain so he doesn't have to accept that his father was one. I can live with being the villain if it gives him some peace. But you're living in purgatory, I'm living with consequences. That's different. I left that day understanding why Thomas was the way he was. He'd constructed a life of routine and isolation, not as avoidance but as penance. Every day without joy, without connection. Without photographs or visitors, that was his punishment for trusting the wrong person. For failing to see what he should have seen. Confronting the past weeks went by. Then months. I found myself checking on Thomas more frequently, bringing him meals Sarah cooked. Inviting him to barbecues, he always declined, making sure he was okay. He tolerated my attention with patient resignation, like a prisoner tolerating a well-meaning guard. Then one day in spring 2021, I made a decision that I'm still not sure was right. I found Marcus Whitmore. Marcus Foster, the name he'd taken from his maternal grandfather. He lived about 2 hours away, worked as a middle manager at a tech company, had a wife and 2 kids. His social media showed a normal life: birthday parties, family vacations, little league games. I sent him a message. I introduced myself as Thomas Sr.'s neighbor. I said I knew the story of what had happened with his father. And I said I thought he deserved to know the truth about his grandfather. Not the version he'd been told by hurt and angry relatives, but the actual documented truth. I attached links to court documents. Thomas Sr.'s deposition. The judge's ruling. Character witness testimony from people who'd worked with Thomas Sr. and confirmed he'd had no knowledge of the fraud. I ended the message, your grandfather lost everything. Not just money and property, he lost his son, his daughter-in-law, his grandchildren, his reputation, his life as he knew it. And he spent 15 years accepting blame for things he didn't do because he thought that's what you needed. He's wrong. You needed the truth. Here it is. I sent the message and immediately regretted it. Who was I to interfere in their family? What right did I have to reach out to a man I'd never met about trauma that wasn't mine? But 3 days later, Marcus responded, I never read the court documents. My mother's family told me Grandpa Thomas had helped my father with the fraud. I believed them because I was 14 and grieving, and I needed someone to blame. Later, I didn't want to know the truth because it would mean I'd spent years hating someone who didn't deserve it. Thank you for making me face this. Can I call you? We talked for 2 hours. Marcus cried. I explained what I'd learned about Thomas Sr.'s life, now the isolation, the routine, the penance. He lives like that because he thinks I hate him, Marcus said. He lives like that because he believes he deserves it. He does deserve better, but he won't accept it from me. It has to come from you. I don't know if I can face him. The guilt is less important than the truth. He needs to know you understand, that you don't blame him anymore, that he can stop punishing himself. What if he won't see me? Then at least you tried. But I think he will. I think he's been waiting 15 years for you to come back. Marcus came to visit 3 weeks later. He showed up on a Saturday afternoon, pulled up to Thomas's house, and sat in his car for 10 minutes gathering courage. I watched from my window, ready to intervene if needed. Finally, Marcus got out and walked to Thomas's door, knocked, waited. Thomas opened the door. I saw him freeze when he recognized Marcus, saw his hand go to the doorframe for support, saw his face, that impassive face I'd seen for years, crack completely. They stood there for a long moment. Then Marcus said something I couldn't hear, and Thomas, my reserved, isolated, broken neighbor, reached out and pulled his grandson into a hug. They stayed inside for hours. I didn't intrude. This was their moment, their reconciliation, their healing. When Marcus finally left, he stopped by my house. His eyes were red, but his face was lighter, like he'd put down a weight he'd been carrying for 15 years. Thank you, he said, for being nosy, for digging, for making me face the truth. How is he? Devastated, guilty, relieved, angry at himself for wasting 15 years. But also, hopeful. He asked about my kids, wanted to see photos, asked if he could meet them sometime. Will you let him? Are you kidding? They need to know their great-grandfather. They need to hear his stories. And he needs to know that family didn't end when my father died. Marcus kept his word. Over the following months, he visited Thomas regularly. He brought his wife and kids. He introduced Thomas to his children as your great-grandpa, who I lost for a long time, but we found each other again. Thomas's house slowly changed. Photographs appeared on the walls. Marcus's family, new memories being made. The curtains opened. The lights stayed on longer. Thomas started smiling, not often, not easily, but genuinely. One day, Thomas knocked on my door holding a framed photograph. "I want you to have this," he said. It was a picture from Marcus's recent visit, Thomas surrounded by his great-grandchildren, all of them laughing at something outside the frame. Thomas looked younger in that photo, lighter, like 15 years of penance had lifted in the moment that photo was taken. "Why give this to me?" "Because you gave me back my grandson. You didn't have to dig into my past. You didn't have to reach out to Marcus. You could have left me in my isolation. But you didn't. You gave me a reason to keep living instead of just existing. I was nosy. You were kind. There's a difference." A life reinvented. Thomas Whitmore died 2 years ago at age 76. Heart attack? Peaceful, in his sleep. Marcus was with him, had been visiting for the weekend, a routine they'd established after reuniting. "Marcus called me from the hospital. He went peacefully," Marcus said. "The doctors said it was quick. He didn't suffer. I'm sorry." Don't be. The last 2 years were the happiest of his life. He told me that. Said that getting to know my kids, getting to be their great-grandfather, made up for everything he'd lost. He died knowing I didn't hate him anymore. That's all he wanted. At Thomas's funeral, Marcus gave the eulogy. He talked about his grandfather's integrity, his honesty, his sacrifice. He talked about the fraud and the suicides, didn't shy away from the tragedy, but he framed Thomas as a victim, not a perpetrator. "My grandfather was lied to by someone he trusted, absolutely," Marcus said. "He was blamed for crimes he didn't commit by people who needed someone to be responsible. He accepted that blame because he thought it would help us heal. He spent 15 years in isolation because he believed that's what his family needed. He was wrong. We needed him. And I'm grateful that in the last years of his life, he finally understood that." After the funeral, several of the fraud victims' family members approached Marcus. They'd read about the reconciliation, had followed the story. They wanted Marcus to know they didn't blame Thomas Sr. anymore. That they'd learned the truth years ago but never reached out. That they regretted letting him live in isolation. "He didn't have to suffer like that," one woman said. "We knew he wasn't guilty. But by the time we understood, we didn't know how to apologize." Marcus was gracious. He's at peace now. That's what matters. In Thomas's will, he left everything to Marcus, not much, just the house and what little savings he'd rebuilt. But he also left something else, a letter. Marcus shared it with me later. "Marcus spent 15 years believing I deserved isolation as punishment for failing to see what your father was doing. I was wrong. Isolation isn't justice, it's just another kind of death. The greatest gift you gave me wasn't forgiveness, though I'm grateful for that. It was teaching me that family isn't blood, it's choice. It's showing up. It's loving people even when they're broken. Daniel Morrison, my neighbor, is more family to me than many people related by blood. He chose to care when he didn't have to. He chose to dig into my tragedy and find the truth. He chose to reach out to you when I couldn't. That's what family does. It chooses love over convenience. It chooses truth over comfort. It chooses presence over distance. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for letting me know your children. Thank you for giving me 2 years of joy after 15 years of penance, your loving grandfather." Thomas I framed that letter. It hangs in my office now. A reminder that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is refuse to let someone suffer in isolation, even when they insist they deserve it. Reflections on trust and betrayal looking back. I understand now that Thomas's story wasn't really about his son's betrayal, though that was catastrophic. It was about Marcus's betrayal. About a grandson who blamed his grandfather for tragedies he didn't cause. Who believed lies because truth was too painful. Who let 15 years pass before facing what actually happened. Thomas survived his son's fraud. He survived the financial ruin. He even survived the suicides. What he couldn't survive was his grandson's hatred. That's what sent him into isolation. That's what made him remove all the photographs. That's what turned him into the ghost of a man I met when I moved in next door. And Marcus's betrayal was, in many ways, more painful than his son's. Because Thomas Jr. had at least lied to steal mania comprehensible, if reprehensible motive. Marcus had blamed his grandfather out of grief and pain, but also out of convenience. It was easier to blame someone who was alive and present than to accept that his father had been a criminal and his mother had been too. Depressed to keep living. I think about this often, about how easy it is to blame the people who stay, who accept responsibility, who don't defend themselves. Thomas could have fought back, could have screamed at Marcus that it wasn't his fault, that he was a victim too, that blaming him was cruel and unjust. But he didn't. He accepted the blame because he thought that's what his grandson needed. He chose love over self-defense. And it cost him 15 years of connection and joy. The broader implications of Thomas's story haunt me. How many other elderly people are living in isolation, not because they want to, but because they've been blamed for things they didn't do? How many families are fractured by convenient lies rather than difficult truths? Thomas's tragedy was that he was too good to defend himself effectively. He was too honest to manipulate the narrative. He was too loving to fight back against his grandson's accusations. And those virtues honesty, love, integrity became weapons used against him. I learned from Thomas that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is refuse to let them accept blame they don't deserve, even when they insist, even when they've spent years building a life around that blame. Sometimes you have to be the person who says, "No, you're wrong. You don't deserve this. Let me help you prove it." Marcus learned that lesson too late. He got 2 years with his grandfather after wasting 15. He'll carry that regret for the rest of his life. But at least he got those 2 years. At least Thomas died knowing he was loved and not blamed. That has to be enough. Final thoughts, my neighbor. Thomas Whitmore taught me more about betrayal, forgiveness, and the hidden stories we all carry than anyone else in my life. He showed me that the quietest people often bear the heaviest burdens. That isolation is sometimes chosen not as preference, but as penance. That the people we dismiss as unremarkable might actually be the most remarkable of all. If I could go back to that day in March 2018 when I moved in, I'd pay more attention to Thomas from the beginning. I'd reach out sooner. I'd ask harder questions. I'd refuse to let him suffer alone for even one day, let alone 5 years. But I can't go back. All I can do is carry forward the lesson Thomas taught me. Pay attention to your neighbors, the quiet ones, the isolated ones, the ones who seem to have no story. Because everyone has a story, and sometimes the most tragic stories belong to the people who've learned to hide them best. Thomas's son betrayed him by using his trust to commit fraud. Thomas's grandson betrayed him by blaming him for tragedies he didn't cause. But in the end, Thomas was redeemed by a stranger who chose to care. And by a grandson who chose to face the truth. That's the real story. Not the fraud or the suicides or the lost years, but the redemption, the reconciliation, the 2 years of joy that came after 15 years of penance. Thomas Whitmore was my neighbor for 7 years. For 5 of those years, he was a stranger living next door. For 2 of those years, he was family-chosen family, the best kind. I miss him. I miss seeing his light on at 5:30 a.m. I miss waving to him as he tended his roses. I miss knowing he was there. Living proof that even the deepest betrayals can be survived and eventually healed. His house sold last year to a young couple with twins. They keep the roses going. They wave when I walk by. They're good neighbors, but they'll never be Thomas, and I'll never forget the lesson he taught me, that the people next door might be carrying secrets and tragedies we can't imagine. That isolation is often imposed, not chosen. That sometimes the most important thing we can do is refuse to let someone suffer alone. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for understanding that betrayal comes in many forms, and that healing often requires someone outside the wounded relationship to shine light on the truth. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to this channel, because there are too many people living in isolation, carrying undeserved blame, waiting for someone to see their truth and help them reclaim their lives. Be that person. Pay attention to your neighbors, especially the quiet ones. They might be waiting for someone like you to care enough to dig beneath the surface and find the tragedy hiding there. And when you do, when you finally understand why they're the way they are, you might discover that helping them heals something in you, too. That's what Thomas gave me. Not just his story, but the understanding that we're all connected, that none of us should suffer alone, and that sometimes the greatest kindness is refusing to let someone accept blame they don't deserve. Rest in peace. It's Thomas Whitmore. You deserved better than what life gave you. But in the end, you got what you needed most: reconciliation with the grandson you never stopped loving, and the knowledge that you were innocent of the crimes you'd been blamed for. That's all any of us really want: to be seen accurately, to be loved honestly, to be forgiven for mistakes we actually made, and exonerated from crimes we didn't commit. Thomas got that, eventually, and for 2 beautiful years before he died. He lived like someone who'd finally been set free from a prison of his own construction. That's the ending he deserved, and I'm honored I played a small part in making it happen. Closing, thank you for staying with me through this long, complex story. If it moved you, if it made you think about your own neighbors differently, if it reminded you that everyone carries hidden stories, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear that isolation can be overcome, that betrayal can be survived, and that sometimes the truth really does set you free, even if it takes 15 years to find it. And if you're living in isolation because of blame you don't deserve, because of tragedies you didn't cause, because of betrayals that weren't your fault, please reach out to someone. Let someone in. Let someone help you prove your innocence and reclaim your life. You deserve better than Thomas got. You deserve to find your truth sooner. You deserve your 2 years of joy to become 20 or 30. Or however many years you have left. Don't wait for someone to dig up your story. Tell it yourself. Let people help you. Accept the love and understanding you deserve. That's Thomas's final lesson. And it's the one I hope you carry with you long after this video ends.